The studio lights blazed down, a harsh glow that turned the debate floor into a stage where every glance, every twitch of the lips carried weight. Viewers leaned forward, not yet knowing that they were about to witness a moment that would replay across the nation for days. Bill Nelson, with his polished smile and well-rehearsed authority, leaned into the microphone. His voice cut through the silence like a knife, laced with condescension. "Congresswoman," he said, pausing just long enough to let the disdain drip. "Perhaps if you had more experience, you'd understand how these things really work." The words landed heavy, the kind of remark meant to diminish, to remind everyone watching who supposedly held the power. For a second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Cameras captured it, the faint smirk tugging at Nelson's lips, the confidence of a man convinced he'd already won. But then came the look. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she fixed Nelson with a gaze sharp enough to cut through his polished armor. A single raised eyebrow, calm and steady, told the audience that she wasn't rattled, she was ready. Viewers felt it instantly, that magnetic tension right before a storm breaks. And when she leaned into her microphone, the atmosphere shifted. What Crockett did next left even her critics speechless. But this wasn't just another debate. What happened in the next 30 seconds would shift the entire conversation. The night's debate was billed as a routine discussion on justice and accountability, but for millions tuning in, it quickly became something far larger. The theme was clear. Whose vision of America would define the future? On one side stood Bill Nelson, the voice of an entrenched political class, polished, confident, and certain that his decades of tenure gave him the right to dictate terms. On the other sat Jasmine Crockett, sharp, unflinching, and carrying with her the energy of a generation that refused to be silenced. Nelson's remark wasn't just a jab. It was a message to everyone watching, a reminder of the arrogance that comes when power lingers too long in the same hands. To him, experience was a weapon, a shield that excused dismissiveness and belittlement. He embodied the old guard, smug, dismissive, convinced that he could steamroll any challenge with a few choice words. But Crockett represented something different. She was dignity wrapped in fire, calm precision paired with unshakable conviction. For the immigrant who saw themselves constantly talked over, for the young voter tired of empty promises, for the working parent who'd been dismissed, one too many times, she became a stand-in, a voice they didn't just hear but felt. That was why this moment mattered. It wasn't simply about two politicians sparring under studio lights. It was about whether arrogance would once again drown out authenticity, or whether sharp truth spoken with courage could cut through the noise. And as Crockett prepared to speak, a spark flickered. Viewers didn't yet know it. But the clash didn't stay confined to the studio. It was about to explode across the nation. For decades, Bill Nelson cultivated the image of a statesman. He wore the years in Washington like a badge of honor, boasting about his experience as if it were proof of unquestionable wisdom. Colleagues often described him as polished, a man who knew the rules of the game better than anyone else. And yet, beneath that veneer of professionalism lay a pattern, a history of talking, down to opponents, brushing off critics, and leaning on his tenure as though it excused him from accountability. There were moments in his career when his tone-deaf remarks stirred frustration. At rallies, his dismissive quips often revealed more than he intended, a belief that younger voices didn't yet understand how the system works, or that grassroots activists were too emotional to be taken seriously. To his supporters, these slips were brushed aside as the bluntness of a seasoned politician, but to many watching, they were windows into an arrogance too, familiar, the kind that silences rather than listens. Nelson thrived on control, rarely rattled, always ready with a condescending smile that suggested patience with those he saw as beneath him. He was the kind of figure who assumed power wasn't just earned, but owed. The Goliath of old politics, unshaken by criticism, convinced that experience alone would always shield him. Yet history has a way of catching up. And arrogance, no matter how finely dressed, always leaves cracks. Nelson didn't see it then, but every dismissive remark, every smirk aimed at challengers, only sharpened the hunger for someone to finally knock him off balance. But arrogance only works until it meets someone who refuses to play by the old rules. Jasmine Crockett's story was never one of privilege or shortcuts. She came into public life not through the gilded corridors of power, but through the grind of community battles, long nights of preparation, and the constant need to prove herself in spaces that weren't built to welcome her. An outsider by every conventional measure, she carried with her the weight of being underestimated and turned it into fuel. Her rise wasn't scripted. It was earned in courtrooms where she fought. For those who couldn't afford high-priced attorneys, in neighborhoods where voices had been ignored for too long, and in political arenas where every sharp comeback was both survival and statement. People began to notice her not because she sought attention, but because she refused to let disrespect go unchecked. Her words cut with precision, but they were grounded in truth, dignity, and lived experience. For countless viewers who felt sidelined or spoken over, Crockett wasn't just another politician. She was a reflection of resilience, of authenticity, of someone carrying the scars of struggle, yet refusing to bow. What set her apart wasn't only her story of struggle, but her poise. She prepared relentlessly, not to impress, but to protect herself against the very dismissiveness she faced on stage. And that night, it would be this poise, this sharpened edge, that made her the one person capable of flipping the script. The tension that had begun with a single, dismissive remark now surged like a rising tide. Nelson leaned forward, his voice sharpening, volume climbing as if authority alone could drown out opposition. "Congresswoman, you don't seem to grasp the complexity of these issues," he declared, words rolling out like a lecture meant not just for her, but for every viewer who dared question him. His tone carried the weight of entitlement, the certainty of a man who had spent decades unchallenged. But Crockett did not flinch. She sat steady, her expression controlled, her voice measured, every response sharpened to a point. Where Nelson's volume roared, hers cut clean. "With all due respect, Senator, complexity doesn't excuse inaction. People live the consequences of policies while you call them complicated." Each counterpoint hit like a scalpel, precise, undeniable, impossible to dismiss. The studio seemed to shrink around them. Cameras zoomed tighter, capturing Nelson's reddening face and Crockett's unyielding calm. The contrast was cinematic, the old guard straining to hold dominance, the new voice refusing to be moved. Even the audience, usually restless during policy talk, leaned in as if sensing history in the making. Every exchange felt personal, yet it was more than two people clashing. It was ideology against ideology, a generation against the one before it. Arrogance colliding with authenticity. The silence between their words felt electric. Every pause waited with anticipation. And then, in one unforgettable moment, Crockett unleashed the words that changed everything. The air grew taut. The kind of silence that signals something unforgettable is about to unfold. Crockett leaned forward, eyes steady on Nelson, her tone calm yet edged with unmistakable precision. "You keep saying the issue is too complex," she began, voice deliberate, almost slow. "But isn't it true, Senator, that you've been in office for decades, while these same problems have only gotten worse?" Nelson blinked, his mouth tightening. He adjusted his tie, buying time, but Crockett didn't give him the luxury. She pressed forward, one question after another, each landing heavier than the last. "You talk about experience. Yet with all your experience, where are the results? Families are still struggling. Communities are still ignored. And the only constant has been leaders like you telling people to be patient." Murmur rippled through the audience. The cameras caught Nelson shifting in his chair, his confidence leaking with every second. He tried to interject, but Crockett raised a hand slightly, not to silence him rudely, but to command the floor with authority. For Crockett, the opposite was true. She wasn't just celebrated for winning an exchange, she was vaulted into the spotlight as a symbol of authenticity, breaking through the old order. Her rise became bigger than the debate itself. It became a viral moment etched into the political memory of a generation. They weren't alone in their frustration, their hunger for change, their need to see arrogance checked. They could point to this moment and say, "Yes, that's exactly how I've always felt." "Tonight," she said, her voice steady but warm, "isn't about me or Senator Nelson. It's about the people watching who deserve leaders that listen more than they lecture. It's about families who need results, not reminders of how complicated things are. It's about dignity, because dignity should never be negotiable." Her words carried beyond the cameras, resonating with every immigrant who had been told to wait their turn, every young person dismissed as too inexperienced, every community silenced by those in power. In that moment, Crockett reframed the clash. It wasn't a takedown. It was a call to action. She drew a clear line between arrogance and authenticity. Arrogance, she reminded the audience, makes noise but solves nothing. Truth, when spoken with courage, can break through even the thickest walls of dismissal. Nelson's bluster had filled the air, but Crockett's calm clarity had cut straight through it. Proof that substance will always outlast swagger. For viewers, the lesson was both simple and profound. America's strength has never come from those who hoard power and belittle others. It has always come from resilience, from fairness, from the courage of people willing to stand tall, even when the odds are stacked against them. The clash was no longer about one debate stage. It was about a larger truth, that leadership in America isn't defined by how long you've held the mic, but by whether your words uplift the people who placed it in your hands. And as the studio lights dimmed, the takeaway was undeniable. Dignity had defeated arrogance. Truth had outshined noise. And millions watching felt not just validated, but empowered, reminded that their voices, too, could rise above and change the conversation. And so the night ended with Bill Nelson sitting in silence, his confidence shattered, while Jasmine Crockett stood taller than ever. She had flipped the script, turned condescension into clarity, and left him, and everyone like him, in regret. If this moment struck a chord with you, don't let it end here. Share this story, subscribe to stay part of this movement, and add your voice to the growing call for leaders who stand with dignity instead of tearing others down. Because this isn't just commentary, it's a community of people refusing to accept the old rules. Because every time someone like Jasmine Crockett stands tall, it's not just a win in a debate, it's a win for all of you.